Ladies and gentlemen, we will have the start of the event financing new nuclear build in very shortly, so please take a seat.
Association of Nuclear Operators, and we have
sure and are having only
future as 2,000, 20,000.
I come back to, for example, I come back.
electricity per year.
Is
You often find a kind of reticence.
as an organization.
Can turn back to you again.
At the time on our
young generation group and promotion.
So if you look at this chart,
currently facing in the world?
But still, the
involvement
of the nuclear equipment market,
become
thank you very much. Excellent.
an atomic energy agent.
Moving in the right direction. Be used energy agents.
when the world needs large scale.
So please take a seat, and we're going to start. So maybe Dario here, and over here. So welcome to this event organized by Nuclear Europe and World Nuclear Association on financing new nuclear build. We've had a number of events today highlighting the importance of having nuclear as part of the solution to the transition towards net zero energy systems. And we know that nuclear is just one of the technologies that is needed, and the investment needs for the clean energy transitions are huge. And today's event will focus specifically on the challenges and solutions related to financing a nuclear new build. Just to give you an order of magnitude, there are different scenarios and different projections on the role of nuclear energy. By the way, my name is Henri Payet. I'm the section head of Planning and Economic Studies at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be the moderator of this event. Just to give you an order of magnitude of what could be the investment needs, we released at the IAEA, we released our projections, nuclear capacity projections to 2050 earlier in September, and the number in the high case scenario was well over 800 gigawatts. 800 gigawatts, and that represents more than 550 new gigawatts of new build to be deployed in 30 years. There are more ambitious, more I would say positive assessments on the role of nuclear that could see nuclear playing an even higher role. But just to give you an idea, that's a huge investment for a new build. So I'm very pleased to be surrounded by distinguished experts and speakers, and I'd like to introduce them. We have Dario Ligutti, who's the Director of Sustainable Energy at UNECE. On my right, we have Christopher McGlade from the International Energy Agency. And to my left, the organizers of this event, Jessica Johnson from Nuclear Europe, and King Lee from World Nuclear Association. So maybe just starting with you, Dario, because we know you have some time constraints. You're going to talk to us about financing the energy transition. So be happy to hear your perspectives.
Hello. Yes. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for inviting to participate to this panel. Indeed, I represent here the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and we've been working on the interplay between different technologies, especially between low carbon and zero carbon technologies, as the right combination for the transition, and that each single combination of different technologies has to be adapted to the conditions of the country, the starting country. In our member states, about 20% of the electricity generation is generated by nuclear. It's 43% of the low carbon generated electricity, and then we believe nuclear is has to be part of the portfolio of technologies that will bring us to net zero. If we calculated in August of last year, we released a report where we said that over the last 50 years, the nuclear energy has avoided the emissions of 74 gigatons of CO2, which is equivalent to 2 years of global energy-related CO2 emissions. So definitely is one of the solutions that needs to be part of the overall portfolio. When it comes to financing, it's a very interesting question because it has to be seen in combination with the other technologies, as I said. There is today, we discussed at the previous panel that we had before, there is a lot of money ready for investment, and what is the difficulty is to bridging that money to projects. When it comes to renewable energies, it's relatively simple, thanks as well to the work that the Commission has done on the EU taxonomy, and the market has been doing a number of projects. When it comes to nuclear energy, it's much harder for three main reasons. The first one is the size of the investment, because we're talking about very, very large, you mentioned, very large plants, although it is new, the small modular reactors technology is actually as let's say as potential, has the potential as we could say, that would lower the initial barrier to investment. It's a very capital intensive industry, the nuclear industry, so definitely lowering that barrier will facilitate the financing. The second one is actually the time for construction. That's another thing that technology, the development of these modular reactors will help in bridging that barrier. We heard today the panel from the French administration that they're looking at 15 years construction period. So 15 years construction period in the financing world is extremely long. You don't get financing at that for those sort of levels. And the third one is obviously the liabilities linked to running a plant, and that could have obviously have an impact in the financial documentation. So those three elements, if in the nuclear industry you find a way to crack them, and I think going smaller reactors in a modular fashion will go towards resolving those issues, at least for the smaller size, and start getting as well private capital. Today, nuclear industry, the nuclear plants that have been built with public money. There are different ways of harnessing public money, whether it's national, whether it's local. We heard, as well the Finnish model, which actually has some private money introduced by having industry involved into the financing, which I think is a good idea, but it's not applicable everywhere, of course. But what is needed in order to bring private money into this market, I think is exactly lowering these three barriers that I mentioned before, and at the same time inserting nuclear as an option in the larger technology interplay. So an investor has a portfolio of opportunities. They are, and they can adopt a portfolio approach when investing in the energy space, and therefore diversifying their own risks, as opposed to just investing in a single project or in a single industry, which increases the risk. So I think that's a little bit that the work we're doing, and that's the reason why at UEC we're supporting, we're sustaining, we're purporting the idea of nuclear as part of a more general interplay among technologies, because that as well, in my view, will facilitate the financing of nuclear and for the development of it, for the transition.
Thank you. Just bouncing on one of the comments you made, you said nuclear energy is a capital-intensive industry, but actually the renewables also are, all low-carbon technologies are capital-intensive. Yet you said it's easier to finance renewables and more difficult to finance nuclear. So maybe this is related to the perception that one technology meets sustainability criteria and the other one does not, or not as much. So what should the nuclear sector do to demonstrate that it is clean and sustainable?
I think there's been some progress with the insertion of nuclear energy in the EU taxonomy. Today, you don't have a green standard besides the EU taxonomy. It's the first one, and it's evolving, and will continue to evolve as technologies evolve. I think when we started, there was no inclusion of nuclear energy in the EU taxonomy. Now, obviously, with what happened over the last year, suddenly it realizes is an important element in the transition, so they put it as a transition fuel, as a transition energy towards a cleaner. I think that's a first step. I think going forward, we need to continue showing that on a life assessment basis, which is what we come out in our report. In our report we came out in August of 2021, we said if you compare on a life cycle basis the environmental footprint of the different energy technologies, and then you calculate your LCE, your level cost of energy, you will see that nuclear is one of the best options that you can have on the basis of those metrics. And then as well, the great thing about nuclear is that it procures the base load, which is not the case for the intermittent renewable energies like sun and wind today. Often they are intermittent. So those two elements combined, I think they need to be made more visible, more transparent, more acceptable to the population on a science utilizing, on a science and data-based discussions. Let's avoid emotions. Let's avoid, prejudices, which generally there are, and let's have instead a science and database discussion on these items, because I think we're important. And for that perspective, we elaborated a tool which is called the Carbon Neutral Toolkit. And that, for policymakers, that Carbon Neutral Toolkit allows policymakers to take decisions on the basis of data and science. And nuclear, of course, comes out as one of the potential options. It has its own advantages and it has its own drawbacks, but like any other sort of technology. And so it's a choice of how you deploy those different technologies in a bouquet fashion that will bring you to the transition. It's not only one technology or the other, it's just you need to play of those, I think. I think that what we need to do is to continue and then make the point about using data and science-based decision-making processes.
Thank you, and I think your comment also about the importance of diversification. This is also needed for resilience of the energy system, and will increasingly be an important factor in the decision making. So thank you for sharing your perspectives. Christopher, I'll ask you your view on technology-specific mechanisms to attract investments and versus technology-agnostic or technology-neutral mechanisms.
Thank you very much. Perhaps just to start, I'd like to give a few reflections on the current energy crisis that we and the world is going through right now. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, clearly we had a huge increase in gas and oil prices. But the key question is, how is the world going to respond to the crisis? And what we've seen so far from governments is very positive in that respect. We've seen the US Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen Repower EU in the EU. We've seen green transformation in Japan. And we've seen a lot of momentum behind clean energy technologies in China and also in India. And these are really going to turbocharge investment into clean energy technologies. And that's across the whole suite of different technologies that exist, whether that's from renewables to efficiency, to nuclear, to end users, to electric vehicles, and so on. And as a result of the crisis, we are therefore seeing this level of investment going into all these technologies increasing by about 50%. So today we spend about $1.3 trillion on those clean energy technologies. As a result of those policies, that's going to go from 1.3 to 2 trillion.
Are these public investments?
No, this is total.
Total.
Public and private. So 1.3 from individuals to companies to financial actors to governments. That will go from 1.3 to $2 trillion. That's a huge increase and is moving us in the right direction. And one of the great things about that increase is that there is this whole suite of different technologies. Nuclear is absolutely part of that. And I think that really shows that in a number of countries, nuclear is part of their solution to help reduce emissions, but also for energy security. And that's really one of the key points I want to make here, is that the reason for that increase in clean energy investment was not driven so much by climate change. It was driven by energy security, and it was driven by wanting to develop the technologies of the future. There's a new global energy economy emerging. We're going to have a shift away from fossil fuels towards clean energy technologies, renewables, nuclear, and many others. And countries want to be part of that. So they are investing in, both in terms of research and development, whether that's into small modular reactors, but also in terms of deployment of wind, solar, and nuclear. While that's all very good news, and I think it's very good news for nuclear in particular, there's two key issues with that increase I mentioned. First of all, it's not enough. According to our numbers, we released our World Energy Outlook just a couple of weeks ago, and it has, as part of that, a roadmap towards net zero by 2050. How can the energy sector reach net zero by 2050? And you mentioned the doubling in nuclear in your scenarios. Well, that net zero scenario also has a doubling in nuclear capacity. So nuclear plays a huge role in achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But to achieve that, we need to get that $2 trillion in 2030 to be $4 trillion. That's a much, much bigger increase than what would be suggested by current policies. And the other thing the caveat around some of the momentum we're seeing is that a lot of that is in advanced economies. And we're not seeing quite so much action in emerging market and developing economies. And this is particularly important for nuclear, because we are seeing in that scenario and in current policy preferences, but there is a shift from a focus on advanced economies to an increasing level of nuclear being deployed in emerging market and developing economies. And if that money, if that investment and if that financing isn't flowing into those countries, you won't have that build out at the pace and the scale that's needed.
Okay, so maybe I'll come back to you with some other questions, but I'll turn to Jessica. Dario mentioned the EU taxonomy as being one of the first system of metrics and to assess the sustainability of clean energy technologies. So what does the inclusion of nuclear in the EU taxonomy mean, and how will this support investment?
Well, because the goal of the taxonomy is to encourage private investment into those technologies that are going to get us where we want to be, essentially it opens the possibility to private finance for nuclear power plants. Now, one of the arguments we often heard in the taxonomy debate was, well, the nuclear industry doesn't need private finance because it gets state aid. Yes, some countries do finance their nuclear power projects with state aid. But even so, even large companies such as EDF, they still need to raise capital on the markets. There are other countries that do not use state aid at all, as is the case of Finland. It is all private finance. So what we had to make sure here is that the nuclear sector was still a sector of interest to the private markets. Because it's not about telling banks or investors, you need to put your money here. It's about telling them, these are the technologies that can get us where we want to be, and so we are providing you with some sort of certainty from an investment perspective. And that's what's important for investors. They need to have that long-term certainty, particularly for nuclear projects which have high upfront costs but a very, very long life. You look at, for example, pension funds. You're investing today to get your money back in 40 years' time. So a nuclear project is of interest to such funds. So from a finance perspective, it was key to make sure that we were still on the list of technologies that banks and investors could consider. But there's also the kind of messaging around it as well. I mean, at the end of the day, the science about nuclear is clear. Nuclear is as sustainable as, for example, renewables. And so nowadays, policymakers really have a responsibility to take political decisions that are based in the science, because the decisions that we're taking today are going to have a long-term impact on future generations. And so, with the science telling us nuclear is sustainable, policy needs to reflect that.
Thank you. So the EU made that decision to include nuclear in the taxonomy. King, what about the rest of the world?
Thank you. Maybe I'll just touch on some of the key points I want to raise. In my view, to facilitate driving financing and investment in nuclear energy require energy policy. Already mentioned about the level of nuclear energy that's needed, doubling in the IEA net zero scenario, and Dario mentioned that the UNEC toolkit also provide projections on pathway for the UNECE region. In their innovation scenario, they see nuclear trebling, requiring over 800 gigawatts, including large reactors and small reactors. The second, I would say, is having the right market, energy or electricity market design that facilitates investment in all technology. And we just mentioned about sustainable finance, and that will help with the right framework that include nuclear, would channel private investment. We mentioned, the large amount of investment needed to have the right to complete the energy transition require private investment. Some of these framework beyond EU, a number of other countries, for example, like China, Japan, and South Korea, their taxonomy already include nuclear. Perhaps I will highlight some of the work that's underway at the moment to drive and facilitate private investment that's needed. As Dario mentioned, there's no global standard to define ESG, but there are work underway right now with the formation of the International Sustainability Standard Board that try to define a global baseline for climate and sustainability reporting. So as part of that reporting, corporate organization and financial institution have to set a climate target and define a transition plan and how to get there. So it's really important that those standards are technology neutral, focused on climate mitigation and including all technology, because those will drive private investment to facilitate the energy transition.
Thank you, thank you. Dario, I know you're going to have to leave us, but maybe you would like to share one more thought or one message before you leave.
Sure, thank you. I think King has well mentioned some of the tools that in our region, and particularly we have developed to support the policy decision-making process. I think one more point, I think, and it has been the speaker, Christopher, mentioned as well, is the role of in the next energy transition, the importance of the critical raw materials. This is something which affects as well the nuclear industry, as you perfectly know, and it's a fundamental condition for the transition to happen. I mean, the transition, the technologies that we have today necessitate a number of, both in quantity and quality of raw materials, very different from the previous transition. We're talking about lithium, manganese, cobalt, uranium, and all sorts of other different raw materials. I think even here, when looking at the policy decisions that you have to take as a policymaker, as a government, as an investor as well, when you're looking at a project, in whatever technology is, you have to take into consideration the availability of the raw materials. And I think it's an issue that we've been trying to put at the forefront of all the decisions. We have seen the crisis, prices of gas and some of those materials already started increasing because of previous to the crisis that we live in now, simply because there was the rebound in economic activity from COVID. But what the IEA is saying, the 4 trillion of investments needed, you need exactly the same amount of investment in mining, in finding and recycling those raw materials. And this includes as well uranium, as a fuel for the nuclear industry, but as well for building the nuclear power plants. You need all these elements. So one thing that my last message in here is, don't forget about the availability and the cost of those raw materials and what it takes to extract those raw materials. And we should not be doing, I have to say this as the United Nations, we cannot do the same errors as we did with the previous transition. When we left wood and biomass and we moved to fossil fuels, we cannot do the same errors in polluting, in not taking into consideration the negative externalities that come with mining, with the extracting, and not recycling, not thinking about the circular way that these minerals and these materials need to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, the transition will not happen, it will not be socially acceptable, and we will be repeating the same errors. Maybe at the COP 127, we will find ourselves here talking about not fossil fuels, but some sort of different problem of pollution problem. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us of the importance of these critical minerals. And but you were mentioning the IEA report, I think last year, but it also mentioned that nuclear was one of the low-carbon technologies that was least dependent on critical minerals. So that's also an added bonus for nuclear power. So anyway, thank you, Dario, for participating in this panel. Christopher, I want to go back to electricity market designs, because we've heard many times that the current model of a deregulated electricity system does not send the signals for investors for capital-intensive long-term projects such as nuclear, and so they have to be financed in a way outside the market, and power purchase agreement, long-term power purchase agreements seem to be one of the I would say preferred avenues from the industry point of view. But can you comment on this?
Certainly, thanks very much. Electricity markets can get very, very complicated, but I think that the key thing which you want the market design for electricity markets to ensure is that they remunerate the services which you want. And that, very importantly, is resilience, and it's about flexibility, so that you have all the electricity available whenever you need it. And this is where nuclear can play a really important part, because it really does provide that stability to the grid, and it can provide resilience to the grid. So I think it's very important that that role which nuclear plays is properly remunerated. Each country will come up with a slightly different mechanism. They will have their own preferred ways of doing it. But whenever we are speaking with governments, that's the key message that we want to get across. So make sure that you are rewarding the things which you want. And in addition to that, however, which goes a little bit beyond just electricity market design, is that there is also broader policy goals, and this in particular is in relation to decarbonisation and to security of supply. And again, as we've been discussing, nuclear really does have a key role to play in both of those. So as well as getting your electricity market design right, you need to make sure that you have those broader policies also put in place so that you are getting the technologies coming through. One thing that we have seen from the current crisis is the importance of security, and that to ensure security, you want to boost the amount that you produce domestically, and you want to make sure that you're able to have that energy available when it's needed. And again, nuclear can fulfill both of those things. So that's where policies are going to remain very, very important for nuclear. We've heard a bit about, it's not just about public financing, but I think public financing should be there to make sure that you have that security of supply, to have that capacity coming online when it's needed.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, so going back to the EU situation, so nuclear is in the EU taxonomy, so that should provide confidence to investors. But at the same time, on the ground, we have seen many projects being delayed and with high cost overruns. So what should the industry do to address those specific challenges to reassure investors?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, there's lessons to be learned by everybody with regards to these projects. Of course, I think the industry we need to really learn from the mistakes made on those projects. I think that's the first thing the industry needs to do. It needs to look at the projects and say, okay, this is where we went wrong, and this is how we can potentially solve that. At the same time, it then needs to work with the policymakers to be able to say to them, okay, if we're able to come up with a realistic rollout plan for nuclear new build projects, this can help us here and it can help us here. And why do I say that? Because if you start sending out the message to say, okay, this is the technology you have, for example, Hinkley Point C, we think that if you're able to support us and we can get the Sizewell C project off the ground, we can reduce the costs by, I think they're estimating 30%. Because as long as you have that kind of follow-on effect, so you don't wait too long between one reactor and the next one when it comes to building. Because there's also by having that conversation and by having an idea of the number of projects that are going to start being constructed in the future over a 10, 15, 20-year period, you can start to build up the supply chain so you can make sure that you have access to all the components you need. And again, it comes in a way to this supply or security of supply issue. Look at having those components manufactured in the member state where that project is being constructed, but also making sure that you have access to all the skills that you need. And the skills, it's broad. It's not just about operating the nuclear power plant. It's also the construction industry, making sure that the construction sector has the workers with the expertise needed to build those nuclear power plants. And that's why, again, that serial effect can be really, really helpful, because you can move the workers from one site to the next. So you keep that kind of flow. And again, that is also beneficial. So it should also be seen as an investment, because you are essentially investing in a national workforce. So you're creating jobs in that member state, and you're creating economic growth as well by having the supply chain, the national supply chain. Again, it's contributing to that economy. So it is about having that conversation with policymakers and making sure that we're all working together to have that long-term vision that will allow for that gradual rollout of the different projects. Obviously today, because of the time it takes to build a new nuclear power plant, it's not a solution to the current energy crisis which we are facing in Europe. What is the solution is investing in keeping our existing fleet online for as long as possible. But we know that even with all the lifetime extensions, it's going to take us to around about 2035. So knowing the time that it takes to build a new nuclear power plant, those conversations need to start happening today. We need to start talking about the financing, so already deciding how we finance those projects so that the financing costs can be lower, if possible, because the cost of capital can also have a huge impact on the cost of a project. And so that with all of that, we can start to plan for the reactors coming online as of 2035 to replace the ones that gradually will come offline, and make sure that we have that long-term vision that's going to ensure energy security in the future as well.
So long-term policy, long-term stable policy that will reassure investors, allow industry to organize itself and attract the workforce of the future. Thank you for that. King, we talked about taxonomies, but what other tools are market regulators and the financial community using or contemplating to drive investments towards clean energy technologies?
Okay, before perhaps I answer that question, I would like to perhaps pick up on the last point and provide a global perspective. I have to say that nuclear projects are being delivered to time and to cost, and nuclear project is low cost. And for example, in China, since 2000, 23 nuclear power plants have been delivered. Of that, the average construction time is about 5.7 years, and 3 of those units are first-of-a-kind projects. So if you take those 3 units set aside, the average construction time is 5.3 years. So those projects are being delivered to time and to cost. And take another example, UAE just are building 4 units, 3 units are in operation and 4 units coming over. Those units are average construction time is about 6 years. So those projects are being delivered to time and to cost. And those costs of those projects are much lower than in the projects that have been currently under construction in Europe and in America. So in terms of the perception that nuclear is high cost, projects are overrun and exceeding the budget are only in certain situations. This is not a global picture, and as Jessica highlighted, to drive down costs and to deliver to time and to budget, what is needed is a long-term program, like renewable have done, to drive down costs. You can only drive down costs and deliver to time and budget. It's learned by doing, having a program, and that currently does not exist in most of the Western Europe, and that have existed in those countries I mentioned it, in China, in Korea, so they have been doing. So what is needed to deliver that and provide investor confidence is having that program of nuclear program, same as any large infrastructure project.
Thank you, and thank you for drawing attention to the examples of China or Korea or the UAE, and I think even Japan, when it built the advanced boiling water reactors, some of these projects were constructed under 4 years, and that's the generation 3 reactors, and we sort of forget about that.
Yes. So the point is, this is not a delivering to time and to cost and having low cost. It's not relating to nuclear technology. It is low cost, and we can deliver the project to time and cost. Is actually having that industrial capability local to where it is needed and building up that capability.
Okay, thank you. Christopher, earlier today, Dr. Pierrot was sitting actually in a chair, and he was having a conversation with Director General Grossi of IAEA, and they talked about small modular reactors. And Dr. Pierrot said the IEA has faith in the role that small modular reactors could play. From the point of view of investment, which is the topic of today's event, how do you see SMRs as being a game changer to attract investments in nuclear new build?
Thank you. I of course agree with everything that Dr. Burrell said on the importance of small modular reactors in our scenarios and hopefully for the world. And there's 3 key reasons and why we are very positive about small modular reactors. And the first one is on financing. One of the biggest problems with nuclear is that it's very, very big. That can be an advantage, but in terms of financing, it can be a disadvantage. Whenever you are into the tens of billions, 20s of billions sums of money, it can be very difficult to get people on board with that because the sums are so large. Just to say, there is also problems on the renewable side. You quite often hear that these projects are too small. You know, if it's only 10 million, that's not big enough to really excite a lot of the international investors or a lot of the key financial actors. There's a sweet spot in the middle there where it's big enough to get loads to crowd in that investment and that financing, and not be so big. And that's where small modular reactors can really start to play a role. When you're around about the $1 billion mark, that's where you can really get the most interest from a lot of these big financial actors. So that's one key reason why small modular reactors can have a big advantage over the existing. The other thing that I think everyone else has mentioned already is the importance of learning by doing. Now, of course, there are some great examples of learning by doing with the existing nuclear fleet and the new builds that we're seeing. But hopefully, small modular reactors can really turbocharge that. By doing the same thing over and over again on a smaller scale, you will drive down costs, and you will then hopefully be able to deploy even more, and you can get into this positive, virtuous circle where you get more and more being deployed. There's unfortunately many examples in the history of nuclear where people think this is going to be the first of a kind that will unleash a new wave, and that hasn't happened. And then that's why nuclear gets its reputation that it's so capital intensive. And the third key advantage of small modular reactors is that it should be possible to repurpose existing power plant sites. If you are retiring a coal-fired power plant and you want to shift towards low emission sources of generation, you have all of your wires leading up to that site. You have a lot of the grids, the infrastructure that's needed to have a power plant, and you can replace that with a small modular reactor. That's not quite the same situation if you're building a new nuclear from scratch. Of course, if we are replacing existing nuclear, then you might be able to get that advantage. But there are many coal-fired power plants around the world, and if we are to achieve our climate goals, if we are to achieve net zero by 2050, we are going to need to retire some of those coal-fired power plants, many of them in fact. And if we can have small modular reactors coming in their place, then that will help reduce their cost and help give us clean electricity.
Okay, thank you. Maybe still on the small modular reactors, but from the point of view of the interest of newcomer countries that are taking an interest in nuclear, some of them are interested in small modular reactors precisely because they have that lower investment, but still, these nuclear projects are still capital intensive. What role do you see for multilateral development bank supporting developing countries contemplating nuclear programs, nuclear new build programs?
I think multilateral development bank have a very important role to play, particularly for developing emerging country. In particular, I think we have to recognise developing an emerging country will perhaps have the greatest increase of energy demand as we move forward. So to help them to provide clean energy, that multilateral development banks can de-risk certain projects and attract private investment. So it's important for multilateral development banks that recognise nuclear energy and support nuclear energy development in addition to other low carbon energy source.
Okay, so the multilateral development banks should have criteria to assess nuclear projects and see how it meets also sustainable development. So we're back at the discussion of the taxonomy in a way, and Jessica, you mentioned how important it is for these taxonomies to be science-based and technology agnostic. With a little bit of hindsight, would you say that the EU taxonomy has achieved that in the end?
I mean, I think it's a difficult one to answer. It's what I was saying earlier. I think the goal of the EU taxonomy is a good goal. Yes, let's identify the technologies and put the money there. The issue with the EU taxonomy is the way in which it then kind of evolved. The criteria could have been easily put in place that would have enabled an assessment of each technology in the same way. So you decide these are the different environmental criteria which are important to us, and we say, okay, let's look based on a whole life cycle assessment what the impact of that technology is in that criteria to produce the same amount of energy. So we were kind of saying, okay, the amount of CO2 that's emitted, water consumption, etc. The reality is that I think for nuclear, that assessment was done correctly. So the JRC report, I mean, it is a very extensive piece of work, and it does include all of that assessment for nuclear, and it has some comparisons with other technologies. For the other technologies, I would say it's less so. There's more of this kind of picking and choosing what we want to apply, depending on the sort of outcome we're hoping for. I mean, the risk with that kind of, the taxonomy is there. We were sort of saying earlier as to whether it will achieve its objective in the long term. I think it's probably too early to say. But I think for investors, I think they probably prefer a more scientific approach to these kind of initiatives than a political one. Because when something is more political, the decisions can change with new governments coming in. So hopefully going forward, the taxonomy will evolve, so it does need to be reviewed. As all EU legislation, it does need to be reviewed. So hopefully they will increasingly take on board criteria that are being used by other organizations to really make sure that it is scientifically based. And also in future, I hope that the taxonomy is going to take into account the other pillars of sustainability, because we talk a lot about sustainability being about environmental impacts, but there are actually 3 pillars to sustainability. Environment, which is a very important pillar, but also social and economic. So hopefully going forward, there will be more work done on the social and economic impacts from the sustainability perspective, and taking into consideration, as mentioned earlier, job creation. I think job creation is an important sustainability factor. So hopefully they'll start to incorporate that and see how local jobs are created as well. Contribution to GDP, that's an important economic impact. And even on the social side, I mean, one of the arguments that was used in January of this year to say, well, they were saying, okay, we have this energy crisis. So this was even before the situation in Ukraine. This energy crisis has been bubbling for a while in Europe. So already in January they were saying, okay, we recognize that nuclear ensures security of supply, but that's not a sustainability matter. Well, from where I stand, the Sustainable Development Goals, access to energy is a human right. It is a sustainability issue. People have the right to access to energy. And so security of supply, in my opinion, also needs to form part of sustainable initiatives when you're looking at the social aspect. So going forward, I hope more and more of this will be integrated. I understand it's a massive amount of work, so it takes time. You have to go step by step. But by doing that and by having this really more scientific approach to all of it, I think it's going to encourage more and more investors to follow it, because by being scientific, it's not going to be subject to changes in political opinion.
Thank you. So we're drawing to an end, and I'd like to ask each of you to maybe share one key message or one thought about the topic, attracting investments in new nuclear. Christopher.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the point I made at the start, which is about the current energy crisis. And what it really does highlight is the importance of security. And this is the driver of so much of what we are seeing in the world today. Policymakers are being driven by concerns over energy security more so than is the case for climate today. And we have to make sure that the solutions to boost energy security are aligned with our climate objectives. And there are many options available here, and nuclear is one of those options. That it can boost energy security, it can help the stability of your grid, and it can also reduce emissions. Also, as we've been hearing, it can be great for developing domestic jobs and new industries. So nuclear really does have that role to play in a number of countries around the world. And this should be encouraging policymakers to support nuclear, and that should hopefully start to crowd in the private finance and the private investment that will be needed to really start to get this doubling in capacity that we see is needed to reach net zero by 2050.
Yes, thank you. So having projects on the ground and success stories will definitely help going in the right direction. Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, we need to look more at what the future integrated energy system will look like, because yes, nuclear at the moment is providing decarbonised electricity, and as I said, in the case of Finland, for example, under the Mankala model, you have the paper industry that invests in the nuclear power plant, and then once it's built and operating, will receive that electricity in return. But we also need to look at the other applications of nuclear in the future, for example, hydrogen, process heat, because again, I think is going to open the door to a broader range of industries who could eventually consider investing in nuclear power plants in the future so that they get access to that process heat or they get access to the hydrogen, because while some can electrify, the reality is a lot of them can't. And so we need to be offering them these solutions, and if these solutions are attractive enough for them, then they will be encouraged to invest in nuclear to produce these solutions. So I think that is a focus for the future.
Thank you for mentioning this, but I think there's a lot of effort to be made to communicate about these non-power applications of nuclear energy, because most policymakers are not aware of them, and the general public is also not aware of them. King, you'll have the final word. You represent the World Nuclear Association, so you have that global view.
I think, first of all, I think it has to be policy. We need to make sure that energy policy include nuclear, as mentioned before, include nuclear as part of a low-carbon energy mix that sends signal and provide the energy market framework, and also provide the perhaps drive for private investment. It have to be, first and foremost, have the right policy framework have to be in place.
Thank you, King. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Dario, who left us. And we will finish the event now. We'll bring it to an end. Thank you very much for your attention.